Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, the topic for today's episode is organisational debt. Yes, we're going to overcome that big elephant sitting in the room. Because no matter who you are or what kind of organisation you work for, no matter where you're located in the world, everybody knows about the pressure to, hey, let's just get things done. And it can be for the sake of stakeholders, the cause, or the bottom line, but the consequences are always the same. Eventually, you amass organisational debt. And much like technical debt, which we've covered on this podcast on many occasions, it has also accelerated amid the recent disruption, where the need to keep things moving at any cost was greater than ever. But if it isn't addressed, the knock-on effect on your culture, your people, and all-round effectiveness can be severe. And ultimately, everyone knows that organisational debt is there. But no one wants to talk about it, much like technical debt. This does need to change, and change fast if businesses are going to be able to rid themselves of complexity and inefficiency. It's a story that I know that you will all be very familiar with. So I want to explore this and also take a deep dive into the power of IT workflows and other ways you can free yourself from these shackles to empower your employees and drive growth, and not just for the remainder of this year and beyond. So today I've invited Jason Fowler, and he's the VP and Head of HR at Northwestern Europe at Fujitsu, onto the podcast today. And although he is currently working away in their office in Sweden, he has gracefully agreed to spare a few minutes with us talking about organisational debt. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Sweden, where Jason Fowler is waiting to guide us through about organisational debt, how to identify it, and how to overcome it. So, a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Hi, so I'm Jason Fowler. I work at Fujitsu. I'm head of HR for our Europe services business. And as of next month, I'll have been with the company for 17 years. So a good portion of my working career has been with Fujitsu.
Fantastic. And I always like to find out a little bit more about, I guess, and your origin story. So how did you get here? I mean, the world of HR and technology, how did those worlds collide? And ultimately,
Yes.
where did your passion for tech come from? Can you remember?
Well, the implication being it was such a long time ago, Neil. But so when I never had an ambition to get into HR. In fact, quite the reverse. I tried to avoid it. I was not in HR when I joined Fujitsu. I started off in technology recruitment in the mid-late 90s, just before Y2K. I was involved in sourcing a technical talent to support customers as they prepared for what fortunately turned out to be something of a non-event with Y2K. I then moved to work for EDS, which maybe people might remember, but founded by Ross Perot, huge American organization, subsequently acquired by HP. But by then I had moved to Fujitsu, and I was in service management roles, supplier management roles, commercial roles, and before transitioning across into HR. And I've had a number of different roles in HR in the 13 or so years that I've been in the function. And I think the experience of having always been in the technology sector and seeing how that has evolved, as well as having been in what we might refer to as business roles rather than HR functional roles, has been quite an advantage when I actually became an HR professional, albeit that title might not be the way that some describe me.
What a great story. And when you mentioned EDS there, I'm sure they were a sponsor for Derby County, my team.
They were.
Yeah.
They were, Neil. Yeah, they were a sponsor for Derby County. That's exactly right.
Man, but there is a whole other podcast right there, and we won't go into it today for obvious reasons. But on this Daily Tech podcast, I do try and demystify technology and address that elephant in the room that so many businesses worldwide are going through, but in a safe space. So today I've invited you on the podcast to discuss overcoming organisational debt. But to begin with and to set the scene, can you provide a bit of an overview? Is what is meant when we say organisational debt? Just like I said, just to set the scene there.
Yeah, of course. So organizational debt, the term I think originated in connection with startups. And It was one of the factors that was identified as quite how startups are inhibiting themselves from moving from the momentum of the early part of an organization's life to actually being able to scale. And I see organizational debt as applying beyond startups. And I think I'd capture it by saying it is really a matter of when your ways of working, your processes, your organizational structures stay the same when the world around you changes. And it becomes an inhibitor to your adaptability as an organization. It becomes an inhibitor to your ability to respond to market change, to customer change, and is one of the major reasons that not only your ways of working, but your organization can become obsolete.
And on behalf of everyone listening, my next question has to be, does that hold any relation to technical debt? Because I think that's something that's often more referred to, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I'd say I consider it sort of a sibling of technical debt. And so some of the features are common. And it's a case of, as can happen in technical debt, taking the decisions to get stuff done, to get the product live, to get the solution live, to get the system live, maybe a feature of technical debt. Organizational debt, similarly, where decisions are taken to make stuff happen, to get things done. But that then the tough decisions on returning to that shortcut to ensure that it is adapted to make sure it can sustain and doesn't become a shortcut that ultimately prevents the organization from moving forward and not giving a platform for growth. That becomes a version of technical debt. It's the interest, I think, that you pay on the decisions that you didn't take.
And a topic we've got to bring up, I know it's been talked about religiously at the moment, and for good reason, because in the last 2 years, every business has been forced, or almost every business has been forced to go from working in the office 5 days a week to remote working almost overnight. And then as that's evolved, it's turned into hybrid working. And then the great resignation has gathered place where people don't feel valued, don't feel they're invested, don't feel they're getting the right training, are just upping and leaving. So I'm curious, if we put all this together, how is this debt currently impacting organisations? And has the situation changed over the last 2 years? Has it been the cause of it?
Well, so I'd hesitate to say it's been the cause. I think organisational debt was accumulating well before the pandemic. But I think the pandemic gives us an example of quite how this has been exacerbated and how the pandemic itself and the consequences of the pandemic have led to a sort of specific version of organisational debt. Now, you mentioned a couple of topics there, Neil, which I think relate very well here. Hybrid working, which is a term that's so often used. I spend a lot of time with externally with peers of mine in the European marketplace, and they're talking about their version of hybrid. Often I find that the conversation doesn't very much go beyond how much work is done in an office, how much work is done not in an office. And there are different versions that each organization has. What hasn't yet occurred is a conversation that broadens this to see what elements of how your organization works, what is management in the hybrid world? How do you support a career mobility, not just remote job sustainability in a hybrid model? And therefore not revisiting and doing the hard yards in looking at how does our company work? How did it work? What now needs to change is organizational debt, and leaving it or reducing the conversation to a where work gets done, and only that would be, in my view, a feature that is high risk of accumulating greater organizational debt. And then that connects to your other point of this other term that I'm always a little wary about reusing so many terms of the great resignation, but this great talent shift. And I think there's a big part of that now. People's experiences, our collective experiences, are 2 years is a long time to form new habits, new perspectives on our lives, new perspectives on our working lives, and our new expectations as well. We have experienced that so much can be done in a very different way than we had assumed prior to the pandemic. But our expectations have shifted with that. What I think leaders need to recognize is that the adaptability of how they work, what is their offer, what will be their culture post-pandemic will be absolutely vital, and you can't address that massive question by simply reducing it down to we expect you to be in the office X days per week, per month, etc.
Yeah, completely agree with you. And I suspect that many business leaders listening, both inside and outside of tech, will have had some kind of experience dealing with technical debt and how to identify it. But is it easy to identify organizational debt? And what are the main things to look out for? Are there any warning signs there that will have people nodding in agreement?
Yes. So there are some high-level things to watch for. So firstly, organizational debt will lead to a deterioration in your financial performance. It absolutely will do that. It will prevent you from deploying new strategies effectively. You may, as a leadership team, as a leader of a department, be wondering quite why it's so difficult to get what you think is a well-articulated strategy to come to life further down the organization throughout your teams. That would be a warning signal to me that organizational debt exists. That would be a signal to me that ways of working are not equipped to be able to adapt and adjust to quite what different outcomes you're seeking to achieve. The other thing that is, I think, a real key to spotting organizational debt is when you have a description, a process, a policy that tells you how things get done in your organization, and yet you find that that's not really how it works. Somebody will tell you, colleagues will tell you, it says you do this, but really you do that. And there is a dissonance between the actual how things get done and the way things are documented, the way things are supposed to be done. And that dissonance, and the longer that perpetuates, the wider that gap becomes, is a version of organizational debt. And it's therefore then very difficult to really understand, how do things get done here in our organization? And if you don't know how things get done today, it's very difficult to make change to that way of working and drive change in your organization for the future.
And I suspect your words there will resonate with people listening all over the world. So I'm curious, once you have diagnosed organizational debt, how important is it to try and manage that debt? And what are the implications or warnings of failing to do that?
Well, so I think it's essential. And I think it's critical that this is considered to be an ongoing, it's sort of fitness of your organization. It's any of us that have tried from time to time to get fit, to stay fit, know that it is not something that's successful if you only do it once a year, once every 2 years, have a short burst, perhaps in January, and see if you can't get yourself in shape and hope that lasts for the remainder of the year. It won't work in that way. It has to be a cultural aspect, a mindset that you inculcate throughout your organization. And that has to be a recognition that it exists. So I think leaders talking about the fallibilities of ways of working, of policies, of processes, of naming organizational debt is a really good start. You start to ensure that you are putting a name to this topic, addressing it as an issue. I think then there is an opportunity to encourage colleagues to seek out organizational debt that is close to them, provide rewards for it. Often companies, when talking about technical debt, we draw that comparison again. We'll offer rewards for coders who may be able to find bugs or glitches in the system and be able to address those, remedy those, and make that system more stable, make that coding more stable. If you have something similar to organizational debt, policies that are no longer fit for purpose, the way of working is really very different from what's documented. This is not likely to enhance our ability to deploy that new organizational strategy. It will, in fact, inhibit it. If you have a channel through which employees themselves can spot, identify, suggest remedy to those, a recognition, a reward mechanism in order for that, you can find a way not only of leaders trying to take responsibility for fixing this issue, but the whole organization trying to ensure that each component part stays fit, stays resilient, stays adaptable, and does so by finding organizational debt and addressing it at source.
And as an ex-IT guy that's always led with solutions, not problems kind of mindset, I've got to ask, from an IT point of view, how can IT workflows help organizations to actually begin to overcome this debt? Because that's where the magic happens, right?
Well, it can. It can be where the magic happens, or it can be where the problem is compounded. So where technical debt and organizational debt conflate, in my view, is where the hard yards on the implementation of a new finance system or the implementation of a new HR system, and I think that's often a cause of this, we're not willing to undertake the hard yards in really understanding quite what the processes are in each department and in each country today, and making the change and getting everybody's buy-in to working in a common way, a different way in the future, and making sure that there is a process change, a ways of working change that's managed very effectively, that the system then enables. What can happen, unfortunately, is that too often that's a very difficult thing to do. It adds time and cost in the short term. And so we take the get it done mindset to cut through that. And it's a false economy. So we then put in a system that has a way of working, and rather than that becoming a change enabler, we in fact just move most of the processes off system. And you find that despite the major investment in a new technology solution, much of what is getting done in your different departments is being done manually, off system, reversion to Excel, reversion to old systems, and then you have that aggregation of organizational debt with technical debt. So it's those moments where the hard yards need to be taken. Leaders need to recognize that the short-term cost will be paid off in spades in the long term. But you've got to have the patience, you've got to have the tenacity to be able to do it. So in a short answer to your question, Neil, I think technology can be a brilliant way of unearthing, exposing, and then rectifying organizational debt, and then putting in place a technological solution that ensures you ingrain a way of working that is free of that particular version of organizational debt. But if you don't take those hard yards, you can exacerbate the problem and then compound it.
And I would say one of the big positive changes I've seen over the last few years is this moving away from everyone working in silos with IT and various departments and stakeholders and none of them talking to each other. So outside of IT, are there any other solutions businesses should be striving to realise alongside those IT workflows and kind of increase that collaboration and everyone on that same journey together?
Yes, well, so I still think, and I still hear, talking to other leaders and HR leaders, and that silo working is a major issue. It still exists, particularly as you get to larger organizations, and there is a lack of join up in terms of a shared intent. That is organizational debt. And one of the ways to crack through that, as I mentioned earlier, I think sort of an incentive, a culture that encourages. There is recognition, there is celebration of those that have identified quite where those blockers exist and how to unpick them could be a brilliant way of working. One of the perhaps overused terms at the moment is wanting to build agility, use agile methods in ways of working that go beyond technology. I think used properly and deliberately, that can be a great way of cracking through the problem of organizational debt. If you have a set of principles, if you have a set of guidelines that are high level enough to be applicable to most situations, but low level enough for them to be meaningful and not just generic that you would find in any organization, those principles, those guidelines can create the environment in which self-organizing cross-functional teams can come together to work on initiatives, and they themselves can crack through that organizational debt problem, and then you have a culture that then becomes self-renewing, and that I think can be very rewarding for the individuals involved. I think it gives a different experience of work. I think it builds more powerful and more productive relationships across cross-functional teams, but you've got to have leaders that are comfortable with that, because often I find that leaders are very keen on the outcome, but very skeptical about the method of getting there, which is empowering teams, giving greater levels of authority than perhaps they might naturally feel comfortable with, and ensuring that those teams are clear on the principles that your organization wants to work to, but then the leaders get out of the way and they see their role as getting out of the way, clearing the pathway for those teams to take decisions themselves, get to an end result, and have a culture, as I say, that becomes self-perpetuating and free of organizational debt.
And I think we've covered organisational debt in depth today, talking about how to identify it, what to look out for, the kind of problems that it can cause if it's left without tackling the problem, and also how to overcome it. But I'm curious, just to bring to life everything that we've talked about here today, is there a story that you can share of a company or a client you've worked with that have been on this journey from beginning to end, and what the end result looks like?
Yes. So I think this turns up in the technology sector quite a lot. And I think organizations that are long-standing in the technology sector have been and remain at something of a crossroads, whereby their history and the legacy of principally infrastructure related supply of technology services is no longer as promising a future as perhaps it once was. So perhaps there's a shift to modern infrastructure, but there's also the necessity of needing to go beyond traditional infrastructure and move into the digital partnership space with customers, and seeing their role not only as providers of technology, but providers of business transformation, of providers of business outcomes. Now that requires a very different set of skills, a very different mindset, but it also requires organizational practices that are quite different. And so I see a lot where technology services companies, certainly those that have been long-standing, and sometimes we wrestled with this challenge ourselves at Fujitsu, have processes that are geared to large infrastructure relationships with customers, are less rapid. Decision-making processes go through multiple levels of hierarchy, because that is the way things have always been done. And the strategic intent to develop a digital partnership relationship with customers and expand the scope of capability to business outcome consulting can be constrained by a legacy of having worked in a waterfall method, of having delivered principally large infrastructure solutions, and that dissonance then creates tension. That dissonance creates a reduced pace of activity, and that dissonance creates frustration in the talent that has the capability to execute on your strategy, but doesn't have the environment in which their capability and their potential can be fulfilled. So that, I think, is a real issue for technology services partners as they look to adapt and reinvent themselves in the marketplace to be relevant to what is required by customers now and what certainly will be required by customers in the future.
Wow. Well, I've loved chatting with you today. I think we covered so much there. And before I let you go, though, we began the podcast talking about your origin story, and it feels like we've come full circle now. And I always ask my guests to leave the listeners with a personal touch of inspiration by sharing maybe a book that has inspired them, or a go-to song to get their head in the zone when they're going on a big, long run in Sweden on a morning before you record a podcast. What will you leave us with today? And is there a story to accompany your choice?
Well, what I'll leave you with is a favourite song of mine, and it's one that I find can suit all moods. It might, on the surface, seem as though it's a little bit melancholy, but I think it's full of optimism as well. And it's "There Is a Light That Never Goes Out" by the Smiths. And it's the song that I persuaded my wife to have as our first dance at our wedding. Not the most obvious choice, perhaps, but it's a song that I think is full of hope and full of optimism, despite it being one that might be perceived as a little bit downbeat by some. So, and I think that's the way I tend to want to look at things. That there is always a good reason to be optimistic, and if it can be done, why can't we do it?
Oh, what a great choice. Man, that's going to be stuck in my head for the rest of the day now. Great song. I'll get that added to our Spotify playlist. And for everyone listening that wants to find out more information about organisational debt, everything that we've covered today, or maybe even contact your team, what's the best starting point for them?
So you can find us on fujitsu.com/ServiceNow. I'm active on LinkedIn. Anybody that would like to get in touch to discuss this or give me their different point of view, I'm always really keen to hear different points of view. Please do get in touch and let me know. And the final thing I would just add on that, Neil, anybody that's interested in a career with Fujitsu, and anybody that's interested in a career with ServiceNow at Fujitsu, please get in touch. And that absolutely includes people who are already experienced, but it also includes people who have no experience whatsoever with ServiceNow. We're investing with ServiceNow in creating talent opportunities for people who might have thought this was not for them, who may not have the typical background of a technology professional. We're really keen to bring different minds, different experiences from people at all stages of the career, from beginning, mid to latter stages. Get in touch. I think we've got something for you.
Fantastic. Well, I think diversity of thought is so important in the tech industry and the entire business world. I'll get that link added to the show notes so people can find you nice and easily as well. And as I said a few moments ago, I've loved how we've tackled the elephant in the room of organisational debt, from identifying it, knowing what to look out for, what happens if you do nothing, and what happens when you overcome it. Fantastic that you brought it to life with a real story as well. But thank you so much for sharing that, along with your great story and a great song. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
What a great guy. And I could have chatted with Jason about technology, football, music, and so much more for hours. But on the topic of organisational debt, what has been your experience? Do you have any war stories or insights that you'd like to share? I'm the easiest guy in the world to get hold of, so simply email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes, or pop by my website, techblogwriter.co.uk, where you'll find out more about how you can work with me, and also browse through 2,000 different interviews, including the ones that I've hosted with Netgear and Citrix too. So I hope you found today's interview as insightful as I did, and I hope you'll join me again tomorrow, where we'll tackle a completely different topic of how technology is transforming our life, work, industry, and even world. So a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.